He fixed her car for free, and she told him he was worthless. But when her wealthy sister saw what he did next, she didn't just thank him. She offered him something he'd never had before, a chance to be seen. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but Mason Cole was already on his knees beside an old rusted sedan, grease staining his calloused hands, the chill of the cracked concrete biting into his bones. His garage, a converted storage unit behind a forgotten roadside diner, was as rough as they came. No polished floors, no fancy lifts, no front desk. Just the smell of motor oil, coffee gone stale, and the weight of dreams he'd long stopped calling that. His shirt was damp with sweat and yesterday's rain. The space heater hummed weakly in the corner, trying and failing to compete with the late winter air that crept in through the warped door panels. Mason reached for a socket wrench that had rolled beneath the workbench, but the movement sent a sharp jab through his shoulder. Old injury, one of many reminders that he'd been doing this alone too long. A coughing engine outside signaled the arrival of his first customer of the day. A quick glance through the grime-coated window showed a glossy white Range Rover idling in the lot. The kind of car that had no business being here. The kind of car that usually drove past places like his without a second glance. The door swung open with a high-pitched creak. Her heels clicked against the concrete like they didn't belong, because they didn't. She wore sunglasses despite the gloom, her lips pressed into a hard line. "You the mechanic?" she asked, voice clipped. Mason wiped his hands on a rag. "Yeah, Mason. What's the issue?" "The car's making a noise, a weird one." She folded her arms, eyeing the garage like it might give her tetanus. "I need it looked at. Quickly." He nodded, trying not to bristle at her tone. "Pull it in." As she stepped outside to move the car, Mason let out a slow breath. He already knew what kind of morning this would be. She wasn't here for help. She was here for control. And guys like him, in places like this, weren't supposed to be seen as anything but disposable. He'd fixed 100 cars like hers, but something told him this one would cost more than it should. The SUV eased into the garage with a low, throaty purr of high-end engineering, its headlights piercing the dusty gloom like an accusation. Mason waved her forward, guiding her to stop just shy of the yellow tape line he'd painted on the concrete floor years ago. She parked with surgical precision, then climbed out without so much as a glance in his direction. "I hope you know what you're doing," she muttered, adjusting her coat collar as if the air itself offended her. Mason bit down the retort that rose to his lips. Instead, he popped the hood and leaned in, letting the warmth from the engine chase the cold from his fingers. A faint ticking met his ears, nothing catastrophic but worth checking. He tightened a few clamps, ran his hand along a hose that had started to dry out. Not urgent, but soon. He glanced up to explain when she cut him off. "This place," she said, arms folded. "I can't believe this is even legal. Looks like a junkyard had a baby with a bus station." Mason blinked. "It's not much, but it works. What exactly is the sound you're hearing?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she circled the space like a judge surveying a crime scene. "I'm hearing whatever's wrong with the car because someone like you worked on it last." He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his belt loop. "Someone like me?" She shrugged, tone icy. "You know, grease monkeys who barely finished high school. No offense." Mason let out a short breath through his nose. None taken. But he felt it. The words landed like grit under the skin. Familiar, irritating, hard to ignore. She leaned against the doorframe, pulling out her phone. "Just fix it. I have somewhere to be. Important people, important things." He turned back to the engine, jaw tight. The kind of customer who talked more with her wallet than her eyes. The kind who assumed kindness was a side effect of poverty, and that patience was proof of powerlessness. And he'd seen her type before, but something about her felt different. Not in a good way, in a dangerous way. Like she was the kind of woman who could leave a bruise with a compliment and still walk away clean. The hiss of the radiator gave Mason his answer before the diagnostics did. He leaned in closer, brows furrowed, as a thin line of steam curled into the cold air like a warning. He reached for his flashlight, angling the beam into the tight space between the manifold and the coolant line. There it was, a hairline crack in the housing. Not fatal, but it would be soon. Behind him, her heels clicked against the floor again. The sound grated. She didn't wait to be addressed. "How long is this going to take?" Mason stood, brushing his hands on the back of his jeans. "You've got a cracked coolant housing, probably from pressure buildup. It's holding for now, but if you drive it much further, you'll be lucky not to warp the block." She blinked once, slowly. "In English?" "It needs a part. I've got it in stock. It'll take a little under an hour." She looked at her phone, then back at him. "An hour?" Her voice rose, sharp enough to slice through steel. "You people always say an hour. Then it's 3. Then it's some made-up charge for labor I didn't ask for." Mason stared at her. "You people?" "You know what I mean." She gave a tight, annoyed laugh. "Shady mechanics who prey on women. You stall us, upcharge us, pretend we don't know the difference between a spark plug and a tire iron. I've dealt with your type before." He didn't respond, not because he didn't have words, he had plenty, but because he'd learned that some people didn't want to understand. They wanted someone to stand on. "I'm not here to take advantage of you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to fix your car." She scoffed. "Right. I'm sure your Yelp reviews are glowing." There were none. His clients didn't leave reviews. They left cash or IOUs or nothing at all. Mason turned away, heart drumming with heat he kept chained behind his ribs. The problem wasn't her car. It was the fact that no matter how many engines he rebuilt, no matter how many lives he helped stay on the road, he'd still be the guy in a stained shirt, working from a garage that smelled like rust and coffee. The part could wait a few more minutes. His pride couldn't. The wrench slipped from Mason's fingers, clattering against the concrete as his patience cracked along with the part in his hands. He let out a sharp breath and shook his head. It wasn't the job. He'd done 100 coolant housings before. It was the way she kept hovering near the open bay, arms crossed, lips pursed, like his every move confirmed whatever low opinion she'd already formed. He retrieved the new part from the shelf, unboxed it, and set to work without a word. Silence stretched between them, brittle and tense. Then, just as he slid the socket wrench into place, she spoke again. "This is pathetic," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for the words to reach him. "I should have called roadside assistance instead of trusting some back-alley grease joint." Mason froze. Not out of anger, he'd heard worse, but something about the way she said it, with effortless cruelty, as if she were stepping on ants and not noticing, made something turn cold in his chest. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on the rag, and walked toward the counter. Without a word, he typed into the old register, printed a receipt, and slid it across the desk. "There's no charge," he said quietly. She looked up from her phone, confused. "What?" "You heard me. It's done. Car's ready. No bill." Her brows knit, suspicion blooming on her face. What kind of business doesn't charge? The kind that doesn't need to be insulted to do their job. A beat of silence. For the first time since she walked in, she had no quick reply. He leaned against the counter, not unkind, just exhausted. "You want to think the worst of me? Go ahead. But don't pretend like you came in here looking for honesty. You came looking for someone to blame." She stared at him, caught somewhere between anger and something else. Confusion, maybe. Or shame. Mason nodded toward the SUV. "You're good to go." She scoffed, snatched her keys off the counter, and stormed out. The door slammed behind her, the chime jangling like a punchline. She never looked back. But someone else did. The SUV peeled out of the lot. Tires spitting gravel like an insult tossed over the shoulder. Mason watched it go, arms crossed over his chest, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He hadn't asked for thanks, didn't need her validation. but being looked at like a stain on society left a sour taste that water couldn't wash out. He turned back toward the workbench, thinking the morning couldn't get worse, until a soft knock tapped against the frame of the open bay door. A different voice spoke. "Is it always like that around here?" Mason looked up. A woman stood just outside the garage, arms tucked into a long wool coat, wind tossing strands of auburn hair across her face. She wasn't dressed like someone who belonged on this side of town, but there was no arrogance in her eyes, just curiosity and something else, concern. He nodded once, weary. "Depends on the day." She stepped in slowly, as if testing the ground beneath her. "I'm sorry about my sister." Mason blinked. "Your sister?" She offered a faint, apologetic smile. "The one who just stormed off. I was waiting in the other car behind her. I saw all of it." Mason didn't know what to say to that. He'd had customers apologize for others before, usually a partner, a friend, maybe a kid, but never a sibling, not like this, not with eyes that held something real. "I didn't catch your name," he said cautiously. "Alina," she replied. "And you're Mason, right? It's on the sign." He gave a small nod. "That it is." She looked around the garage, not with judgment, but interest. She didn't seem to notice the cracked floor, the peeling paint, the dented toolbox he'd dragged from his grandfather's barn when he was 19. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. "She had no right to talk to you like that," Alina said gently. "You helped her. She just didn't know how to accept it." He shrugged. "Wasn't about her. I've heard worse. But that doesn't mean you should have to." The words hit harder than he expected. They settled in the silence between them where noise had just been minutes before. She looked around once more, then back at him. "Mind if I stay a minute?" Mason studied her face, searching for the angle, but there wasn't one. He nodded. "Yeah, sure, if you want." Alina stepped further inside, her heels clicking softly against the concrete, but she moved differently than her sister. Slower, like she was willing to let the space speak before she did. Mason went back to organizing his tools, partly to avoid staring, partly because he didn't know what to say to a woman like her standing in a place like his. "You work alone?" she asked, breaking the silence without shattering it. He nodded. "Yeah, always have." "No employees?" "No money for that." He glanced at her, then looked away. "People bring in what they can. I fix what I can. It's not glamorous, but it keeps the lights on." Alina walked past the bench where he kept the used parts, her fingers grazing the edge of a rusted engine block like she was reading its scars. "You fixed her car in 10 minutes. She got lucky." "No," she said, meeting his eyes now. "You're good." Mason didn't respond. Compliments had always made him uncomfortable, especially when they came from people with pressed coats and clean fingernails. He'd been burned before by people who smiled at his grit one day and looked down their noses the next. She took a seat on the old metal stool near the counter, the same one he'd almost thrown out last year. "I've never seen her get rattled like that. She usually walks into places and owns them." He raised an eyebrow. "She tried? Didn't work here." That's exactly what rattled her. The air felt strange now, thick but not with tension, with curiosity. Alina didn't seem to be studying the shop. She was studying him, and that made Mason feel more exposed than the open bay door. "Look, if this is some kind of guilt trip," he said, forcing a lightness he didn't feel, "you don't have to babysit me because your sister can't act right in public." She tilted her head. "That's not why I'm here." He paused. "Then why are you?" Alina didn't answer right away. She just offered a calm, quiet smile. "Because I've met a lot of people with money," she said softly, "and not enough with integrity." And just like that, Mason realized this wasn't the end of a bad day. It was the beginning of something else. The wind picked up outside, sweeping dust across the open bay and rattling the tools on the wall just enough to break the silence. Mason leaned against the workbench, arms folded, watching Alina as she took in every detail of the space like it mattered, like he mattered. That was new. He didn't trust it yet. People like her didn't hang around garages like his. They passed through on their way to cocktail lounges or corner offices with marble floors. They didn't sit on crooked stools in rooms that smelled like rust and gasoline. But she was still there, coat wrapped tight, eyes steady. He grabbed a rag, more out of habit than need, and started wiping down a socket set he'd already cleaned twice that morning. "You really saw the whole thing?" he asked without looking up. "From the second she walked in. And you didn't step in?" Alina's gaze didn't flinch. Would it have changed anything? Mason considered that. No one had ever stepped in before, not the customer who watched him get yelled at over a $12 part, not the landlord who promised repairs but only showed up when rent was late. People looked away when it was easiest, but something in her tone didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like honesty. "She's not a bad person," Alina said. "She just grew up thinking she could get her way if she made other people feel small. It's easier to be in control when no one challenges you." "Well," Mason muttered, "she picked the wrong garage." A quiet laugh slipped from her lips. It caught him off guard. He looked at her fully now, not just as some well-dressed woman making conversation, but as someone different. Her coat was designer, but her eyes told a different story. They held weariness. Not the kind that came from money, but from being surrounded by it for too long. "I know how to read people," Mason said. "She came in swinging. You didn't. So why are you really here?" Alina shrugged slightly, as if she wasn't sure herself. "Because something about the way you handled her," she trailed off. "It reminded me of something I forgot existed." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Dignity," she said, "and decency. Most people fake it. You didn't even try." The air between them shifted again. Not tension, not attraction, something deeper, recognition. And it scared him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning the sky was the color of steel wool, and the air bit with the kind of cold that crept into your joints whether you wanted it there or not. Mason was under the hood of a battered old truck when he heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, too smooth, too deliberate to be random. He didn't need to look. He knew. Alina stepped out of a sleek black sedan, this time without the coat or the distance. Her sweater was plain, her jeans cuffed above worn boots, still elegant, still composed, but less polished now, more real. She was holding 2 paper cups. Mason stood, brushing his hands off against a rag tucked into his belt. "Didn't peg you for the kind of person who made return visits," he said. "Didn't peg you for the kind of person who fixed things for free," she replied. She handed him one of the cups. Black coffee, hot, no frills, no caramel drizzle or whipped cream distractions. He nodded a quiet thanks and took a sip. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need filling. Then she asked, "Do you always start your days like this?" "If I want to eat," Mason said. "Truck's been stalling out every few blocks. Owner's a single mom, works 2 jobs. I keep it running so she doesn't lose both." Alina looked at him like she was trying to fit him into a world she thought she understood. But he didn't fit. Not cleanly, not quietly. That seemed to bother her in a way she couldn't explain. "You ever think about doing something more?" she asked. "Opening a real shop? One with a proper lift, staff, a front office that doesn't smell like motor oil?" He let out a half laugh. "You mean a place people like your sister would actually walk into?" Her eyes flickered to him, sharp but not defensive. "She doesn't speak for me." Mason stared at the ground for a second, then at the truck, then back at her. "I had plans once, Pa," he said, voice low. "Wanted to open a training garage for foster kids aging out of the system. Give them something to hold on to, but plans don't pay rent, so now I fix what breaks. That's the job." Alina didn't speak, just nodded, like she saw something in him that deserved more than silence, but not pity, never pity. She finished her coffee, set the cup down carefully on the edge of the bench, and gave him a look he wasn't used to getting. Not admiration, not charity, respect. Mason stared at the ground long after Alina left. Her footsteps faded into the distance, but her words didn't. They stayed lodged in his head like grit under a fingernail. You ever think about doing something more? It wasn't the question itself that stuck. It was the way she asked it. Not with pity, not like a savior, but like someone who genuinely wanted to know the truth. He hadn't talked about the foster program in years. Not since the night he packed up the last of the flyers he'd printed and threw them in the dumpster behind the hardware store. Nobody had signed up. No one had donated. No one had believed that a guy like him could build something that mattered. And eventually, neither did he. He went back to work on the truck, but his hands moved slower now, distracted. Every wrench twist felt heavier. The memories wouldn't let him work in peace. Back then, he'd been 19, fresh out of the system himself, armed with nothing but stubbornness and a vague sense of justice. He thought if he could just keep a few kids from ending up like him, alone, scraping by, with no one in their corner, it would have all been worth it. He worked nights, saved every dime, bought this broken-down garage when no one else wanted it. He remembered the first time he patched together a lesson plan, wrote it by hand, printed copies at the library, brought out donuts on the first day of the program, convinced a few flyers would pull kids in off the street. No one came. Not that day. Not the next. After a month, he gave up. Dreams were expensive, and failure had rent to pay. Now, years later, a stranger with warm coffee and sharp eyes had walked in and spoken about that dream like it still had breath, like maybe it hadn't been buried, just sleeping. Mason tossed the rag onto the workbench, his jaw tight. He didn't like what hope did to people. It got you looking up, got you expecting things, got you crushed. But no matter how hard he tried to bury it, the truth was back. He'd wanted more, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one who saw it. The next few days came and went like exhaust through an open hood, loud, necessary, and gone, before you could process what just happened. Mason worked harder than usual, throwing himself into every busted engine, every squeaky suspension, anything to avoid thinking about Alina. But she kept showing up anyway, not physically, in his mind, in the way her words echoed when the garage got too quiet, in the way she'd looked at him, not like a project, but like a person. He wasn't used to that, and when she returned 5 days later, holding a manila envelope instead of coffee, Mason knew today wouldn't be like the rest. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight through the bay like she'd been there her whole life. "You free for a minute?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I guess." Alina handed him the envelope. "Read it." Mason wiped his hands before taking it, but the grease still smudged the flap. He opened it and scanned the first page. It was a business proposal, cleanly formatted, logo mock-ups, a projected expense report, funding model. It had a title, Cole's Garage, Apprenticeship and Training Program, his name, his words, his dream, on paper. He didn't speak, couldn't. "I wrote it up based on what you told me," she said. "I made some calls. There are grants, small business loans, nonprofit partnerships, and I can help with the startup capital." He looked up, stunned. "You did this?" She shrugged like it was no big deal. "You already built the foundation. I just gave it a spine." His throat tightened. "Why?" Alina looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "Because I've seen what real wealth looks like, Mason. Trust funds, beach houses, art that costs more than hospitals, but I've never seen someone hold this much purpose in their hands and do nothing with it, and I'm tired of investing in things that don't matter." Mason set the papers down slowly. He felt stripped bare. This wasn't a gift. It was a mirror. She was showing him everything he'd buried, every version of himself he'd let die. But he didn't move, didn't reach for her, didn't say yes, because somewhere deep down, the fear was louder than the hope, and fear was the only thing he'd ever learned to trust. The garage was quiet after she left, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt haunted. Her proposal sat on the workbench, pages slightly curled from where his hands had gripped them too hard. Mason hadn't moved in 10 minutes. He just stood there, staring at the paper like it might explode if he blinked. He didn't know how to handle generosity, not like that. Not from someone like her. The last person who offered him help had tied it to string so thick they strangled him. It was a former foster parent who wanted to feel like a savior, parading him around town as their success story until he stopped smiling on cue. After that, Mason learned to build alone, fix alone, survive alone. Trust had been the first thing he gave up. Now, here was Alina, offering a blueprint for the very thing he'd once tried to build, offering it with calm eyes and no conditions. But that's what made it worse. She wasn't asking for anything. That kind of kindness was dangerous, because it made him want to believe it was real, but reality had sharp edges, and it never waited long to remind him. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the open bay door when the crunch of tires returned. The SUV, the same white one from before. It pulled in like a storm cloud, and this time Mason wasn't caught off guard. She stepped out in heels again, makeup perfect, eyes cold, no apology in sight. "You gave her my file," she said. No greeting, no smile, just accusation. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Didn't give her anything. She showed me your name on a nonprofit draft, said you're starting a training program, said she's helping." Her lip curled. "She doesn't help people, she buys them." He wiped his hands on his rag, trying to keep calm. "Then maybe I'm not for sale." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Don't think she's any different from the rest of us. She might dress it up better, but in the end, she gets bored just like everyone else. You're a nice charity case now, that's all." Mason's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "You done?" She gave him a long look, then turned back toward the car. "Don't come crying when she drops you." The engine roared to life, and she was gone, but the echo of her words stayed behind, longer than Mason wanted to admit. Mason didn't go inside after she left. He just stood there in the open bay, hands braced on the edge of the workbench, eyes locked on the floor like it had answers. The late sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the tools scattered around him. The chill in the air deepened, but he didn't notice. His mind was too loud, too tangled. He didn't care what that woman thought. At least that's what he kept telling himself. But she'd touched a nerve, and that's what pissed him off. Because underneath the bravado, there was a part of him, small, hidden, but still alive, that believed she might be right. People like Alina didn't stay. They visited. Toured lives like his the way rich folks toured old cities, soaking in the character before flying home to something polished. And Mason had been a stop on someone's tour before. Once was enough. He didn't hear her footsteps until she was already halfway into the garage. Alina stood just past the threshold, hands buried in the pockets of her jacket. Her hair was wind-blown, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, they were locked on his face like she already knew something was wrong. "You're pulling away," she said quietly. He looked at her, then away. "I'm thinking." "About what?" He didn't answer. She stepped closer. "My sister came by, didn't she?" He gave a half nod. "And she said something to make you question me." He didn't deny it, just ran a hand down his face and let out a long, rough breath. "I've spent years trying to build something from scraps. My name doesn't mean anything. I don't have connections or degrees. And when someone like you shows up, offering help with no strings, yeah, I start asking myself what the catch is." Alina walked until she stood directly in front of him. "There is no catch," she said. "But if you keep pushing people away just because the last ones hurt you, you're going to miss the ones who don't." Mason looked at her then, really looked. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel angry. He felt afraid, because believing her might mean everything he'd buried still had a chance to live. The rain started soft, barely a whisper against the metal roof of the garage, then grew steadier, a rhythm that echoed through the space like a warning Mason didn't know how to read. He hadn't spoken since Alina's last words. She stood there waiting, arms still in her pockets, not pushing, not filling the silence, just present. He hated how much that meant. He turned away, picking up a wrench he didn't need, tightening a bolt on a car that didn't have a problem. Anything to keep his hands moving, anything to keep from looking her in the eye again. "You should go," he said finally. Her voice didn't waver. "Is that what you want?" Mason didn't answer. Outside, the rain picked up, a sudden downpour that hit the pavement like applause. Cold wind swept through the bay, but neither of them moved. He could feel her watching him, feel the heat of her eyes on his back. It burned more than the air ever could. "I know what it feels like," she said, "to not trust people, to be used, to wonder if every good thing is just another setup to fail." Mason set the wrench down slowly, the sound of metal against wood sharp in the quiet. "I didn't grow up like your sister," she continued. "I didn't throw tantrums in designer clothes or crush people under my heel to feel powerful. I just learned to disappear, to keep the peace, to do what was expected, and somewhere in the middle of all that pretending, I lost the parts of me that felt real." He turned then, finally, slowly, rain glistening on the edge of her coat, her hair damp around her face. "Then why come here?" he asked, voice rough. "Why me?" Alina looked straight at him, eyes unwavering. "Because you didn't flinch when someone tried to break you. You didn't shrink to make someone else feel big. You stood there, quiet, calm, and still kind. That's not just rare, Mason. That's real." The wind howled outside. A car splashed through a puddle on the road. He stepped closer, not touching her, not speaking, just near enough to feel the truth settling between them. And for the first time in a long time, Mason didn't want to be alone in the storm. The lights in the garage flickered once as thunder rolled in the distance, low and guttural, like the kind of warning that comes before a bad decision or a breakthrough. Mason didn't move. Neither did Alina. They stood in that breathless space between words and consequences, the rain hammering the roof like it was daring one of them to speak first. She took a small step forward, not bold, not dramatic, just enough to close the space between them until her breath mixed with his. He didn't step back. "I'm not asking you to let me in," she said softly. "I'm asking you to stop locking yourself out." Her voice carried the weight of someone who knew how heavy doors could be, especially the ones we build around our own hearts. And maybe that's what finally cracked something in him, not the kindness, not the persistence, but the quiet understanding that she wasn't trying to fix him. She just wanted to be near him while he figured out how to fix himself. Mason looked down, rainwater pooling near his boots. He'd spent years surviving, years being useful, reliable, silent. But no one had ever looked at him like he was more than that. Not until now. Not until her. He reached over and grabbed a blanket from the bench, the one he kept for cold nights when he had to sleep in the back office. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, fingers brushing his just briefly. Electricity. Not romantic, not yet, just real. He pulled a chair over and sat, elbows on his knees, heart thudding like a loose piston. Alina sat on the edge of the desk across from him, legs crossed, blanket draped around her shoulders, eyes never leaving his. "You think I'm going to break your life," he said quietly. "I think you're scared I won't," she replied. He laughed, just once, short, bitter. "Maybe I am." "Then let's not make promises." "Sis," she said, "let's just sit here, in the rain, as two people who got tired of pretending." Mason nodded slowly. That he could do. For tonight, at least, the storm outside wasn't the only thing he was learning to weather. Morning came slow and heavy. The storm had passed, but the air still carried the scent of wet pavement and unanswered questions. Mason hadn't slept. He'd dozed in his office chair for maybe an hour, but his mind never stopped working. Not on engines, not on repairs, on her. Alina had left sometime after midnight, blanket folded neatly on the counter, a quiet note scrawled in black ink on a scrap of cardboard. You don't have to say yes, but you can't keep saying nothing. He read it 5 times, then once more just to be sure it wasn't a trick of fatigue. She'd seen too much now, not just the garage or the ghosts welded into the walls. She'd seen him. And Mason couldn't shake the feeling that if he let her stay too close too long, she might see the cracks he couldn't cover up with grease or silence. He went outside, dragging a rusted trash bin to the curb, when he saw the envelope still sitting on the workbench. Her proposal, untouched since the last time he opened it. It didn't look as intimidating now, just paper, ink, numbers, but the weight of it hadn't changed. He opened it again, slower this time. Every line felt like a challenge, the financials, the logistics, the forecast projections, but it was the mission statement that got him. To build something that outlives the man who started it, to teach hands that were never trusted to hold anything. It wasn't just his idea anymore, it was hers too. That scared him more than failure, because if they did this together and it worked, really worked, then he'd owe something bigger than thanks. He'd owe belief. And Mason didn't know how to believe in a world that had never believed in him. The door creaked open behind him. He turned, expecting a customer. Instead, it was Sam, the kid from 2 blocks over, the one who always rode by on a crooked bike with a busted chain. "Hey, Mason," Sam said, "you ever teach people how to fix stuff?" Mason looked at the paper in his hands, and for the first time he didn't say no. Sam's question echoed longer than it should have. Mason stared at the kid, who looked half expectant, half ready to be turned away. That was the part that got him, the way even a 12-year-old could brace for rejection like it was routine, like it was just part of asking for anything. Mason didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward the old folding chair near the workbench. "Grab a seat." The kid blinked. "Really?" I didn't stutter. Sam dropped his bike in the gravel and hustled inside, trying to play it cool but failing miserably. Mason smirked in spite of himself. The kid was all elbows and curiosity, sneakers soaked from puddles, and eyes too sharp for his age. He reminded Mason of someone. He grabbed a ratchet set and rolled it onto the counter. "Ever take apart a starter motor?" Sam shook his head. "Good," Mason said. "Means you won't have any bad habits." For the next hour they worked in near silence, Mason pointing, Sam learning. Grease stained the kid's sleeves and sweat dotted his forehead, but he didn't complain. Not once. He listened, asked the right questions, and never looked at the clock. When they finally got the starter reassembled, Mason leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. "You're a natural." Sam grinned, a little unsure if it was a joke. "You think?" "I know." The kid beamed, then the words slipped out before Mason could stop them. "You want to come back tomorrow?" Sam's face lit up. "Seriously?" "Yeah, might need help rebuilding the alternator on that Civic out back. Could use an extra pair of hands." "All right," Sam said, trying to sound casual, but Mason caught the way he bounced on his heels. When the kid left, Mason watched him ride off, the bike chain still rattling like a loose truth. He didn't realize Alina was standing behind him until she spoke. "You didn't say no." He turned, her voice both familiar and jarring. She held 2 coffees again. He took one. "I guess I'm tired of being the guy who says no," Mason said. She smiled, and this time he didn't look away. The letter came in a plain white envelope, folded and slipped under the garage door like bad news trying to sneak in unnoticed. Mason didn't find it until late afternoon, after a full day of back-to-back repairs, oil-stained hands, and Sam asking questions faster than he could answer them. He picked it up, thumb already stained with grease, and unfolded it with caution. One glance at the letterhead, and his stomach dropped. It was from the landlord. He read the first sentence, then the second, and by the third, his jaw had gone tight. The building had been sold. New ownership. 30 days to vacate. No warning, no discussion, just a deadline. Mason stood there in the center of his shop, the place he'd poured years of his life into, surrounded by engines he'd brought back from the dead, and for the first time in a long time, he, felt the ground shift under him. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough to make him realize nothing was ever really secure. Not when you built it on borrowed space. He walked out back, letter still in hand, and lit a cigarette he didn't even want. He hadn't smoked in over a year, but today felt like the kind of day that brought back old habits. Alina showed up 10 minutes later. She didn't need to ask. She knew the moment she saw his face, the kind of knowing that didn't need words. "What happened?" she asked, stepping into the fading sunlight beside him. He handed her the letter. She read it once, quietly, jaw tightening. "They can't do this," she said. They already did," Mason cut in. "I've got 30 days. Alina looked at him, really looked. "You can fight it. I'll help you." Mason shook his head. "I don't have time for court. I don't have time for battles I won't win." She reached for his arm and he let her. "Then we find another way," she said. He didn't answer, because deep down, Mason had always feared this moment, not just the loss, but the question that came with it. What do you do when everything you've built gets ripped out from under you, and someone else is standing there offering to help hold you up? Mason spent the next few days moving like a man underwater, slow, quiet, suspended in something thick and invisible. The garage buzzed as usual, with the sounds of clanging metal, rattling parts, and the occasional crack of a stubborn bolt, but Mason barely heard any of it. He was going through the motions, but his heart was already packing boxes. Sam kept showing up, still full of questions, still eager, still wiping his hands on his jeans like every stain was a badge of honor. Mason couldn't bring himself to tell the kid that the shop wouldn't be here long enough for him to earn any. Alina checked in each evening. Sometimes she brought dinner, sometimes just silence. But she never pushed, not once. And that, more than anything, made it harder to keep her at a distance. On the 6th day, Mason walked the perimeter of the garage with a flashlight, inspecting the corners like he used to when he first bought it, when he still believed this place could be something more than just survival. Dust had gathered along the windows. Paint peeled from the back wall where the rain had leaked in through the years. Every crack told a story. Every stain was a scar. He'd given this place everything, and now he was being told to let it go like it never meant anything. He made the call the next morning, not to the landlord, not to a lawyer, to himself. He would walk away, not with bitterness, not with fire, just with the quiet kind of acceptance that comes when you've lost things before and learned that pain doesn't kill you. It just teaches you how to breathe differently. By afternoon, Mason started packing the back room. Tools first, then boxes of spare parts. One by one, he dismantled the place he had spent half his life building. He didn't want help, didn't want witnesses. But as he reached for the old framed photo of him and his grandfather, covered in dust, propped on a shelf behind the compressor, he heard footsteps behind him. "I told you," Alina said softly. "You don't have to do this alone." He didn't turn around, but he didn't tell her to leave either. The rain came back like it had unfinished business. It hit the roof hard and steady, the kind of storm that made you feel like the sky was trying to wash everything away. Mason stood in the middle of the empty garage, boxes stacked around him, the walls stripped bare. The silence inside felt even louder than the storm outside. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He'd spent all morning loading tools into the back of his truck, clearing the office, shutting down machines one by one, like he was turning off pieces of himself. Alina had offered to help, but he said no. She didn't argue. She just stayed, quiet near the doorway, hands in her jacket pockets, eyes on him like she knew better than to fill the silence with words. When the last wrench hit the bottom of the box, Mason looked around the room for what felt like the 100th time. What had once been his world now looked like someone else's forgotten project. Cold concrete, bare shelves, dust trails where memories used to sit. "I never got the chance to say goodbye to this place the right way," he said finally, voice low. Alina stepped closer. "Then don't say goodbye. Just Say, see you somewhere else. He turned toward her, exhaustion in every line of his face. It doesn't work like that. People like me don't get second chances, Alina. We get recycled into someone else's cautionary tale. She shook her head. No, people like you are the reason second chances exist at all. Mason laughed under his breath. Not sarcastic, just tired. You always talk like you believe in something. I believe in you, she said. The words landed like a gut punch. Simple, undeniable. She didn't dress them up, didn't soften the blow. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a set of keys. What's this? Turn around? He did, and through the haze of the rain, parked across the street, was a truck. Not just any truck, his truck, the one he'd dreamed of, the one he'd sketched in notebooks and circled in auction listings, except this one had a logo stenciled on the side in fresh black paint. Cole Automotive, built on grit, fueled by heart. He stared at it, blinking like the rain was lying. I bought the land, Alina said. 1 block over, zoned and ready. I'll front the cost. You name the rules. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The storm had finally brought something worth keeping. The engine of the old truck hummed steady beneath Mason's hands, a low growl like something finally waking up after too long in the dark. He tightened the last bolt, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stepped back. Across the lot, the new garage stood half-built, steel frame up, insulation in, roof waiting for final panels. The sign hadn't been hung yet, but it was sitting on the ground, wrapped in a weatherproof tarp, like a promise. Cole Automotive. It didn't feel real, not yet, but it was happening. The crew Alina brought in worked fast, efficient, professional, no questions about where the money came from or why the guy in work boots and a torn flannel was calling the shots. She made sure of that. She didn't stand over him, didn't micromanage. She just backed him up. Quietly. Consistently. And that made all the difference. He still didn't know how to talk about it, about what she'd done, about what it meant to be believed in. Most days he couldn't look her in the eye without wondering when it would all come crashing down, because good things weren't built for men like him. They showed up, stayed just long enough to leave a scar, and then disappeared. But Alina didn't disappear. She showed up that morning with a box of coffees and a stack of blueprints rolled under her arm. She didn't wait for him to ask. She just walked beside him, pointing to the framing, asking about the placement of the lifts, the office, the waiting area. She knew the difference between helping and hovering. "What do you want the inside to feel like?" she asked him as they stood in the middle of the skeleton of what would be his shop. He didn't answer right away. He looked around at the steel beams, the gravel still underfoot, the future still dripping in uncertainty. "Like it belongs to people who never thought they'd belong anywhere," he finally said. Alina didn't speak, just nodded, because she knew exactly what he meant. And Mason realized, maybe for the first time, that he wasn't just building a garage, he was building a home. The first time Mason flipped on the breaker, the lights didn't flicker, they blazed. Clean white light flooded the space, bouncing off fresh painted walls and gleaming off brand new equipment. The hum of electricity pulsed through the bones of the building like it was breathing for the first time. It wasn't just a garage anymore. It was real, tangible, alive. Sam stood in the middle of the bay, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. "It looks different." Mason let out a breath. "Yeah, it does." The kid's voice dropped to a whisper, like he was afraid speaking too loud might break the spell. "You really did it." Mason glanced around. 3 hydraulic lifts. A waiting area with a coffee machine that didn't sputter or leak, a back office that didn't smell like mold, a wall-mounted tool chest that locked with the soft click of respect. "We did it," Mason said, "and we're just getting started." Word had gotten out fast. They hadn't even opened yet, and already Mason was getting calls from old customers, curious neighbors, even a local community center, asking if they could send teens by for weekend classes, and every time the phone rang, he waited for that old voice in his head, the one that said, "This was too much, too soon, too good." But lately, that voice was getting quieter. Alina arrived later that afternoon, her boots echoing on the new concrete floors. She wasn't in business attire, just jeans and a t-shirt that had a smudge of dirt on the shoulder, like she'd been helping the contractors. She looked around, then at him. "You ready for tomorrow?" she asked. Mason nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The ribbon cutting was scheduled for 10 a.m. A few local press outlets were coming, nothing big, nothing flashy, but enough to make it real. He walked over to the back wall where a simple wooden plaque had been mounted. Just 5 words carved in clean script. "Hands that build, don't break." Alina read it, then looked at him. "That yours?" "No," Mason said. "It was my grandfather's. He said it the first time I held a wrench." She smiled. He'd be proud. Mason didn't say anything, but he hoped she was right. The morning of the opening, the sky was a perfect blue. Too perfect. Mason didn't trust skies like that. They looked calm, but they always came with something unexpected. He stood in front of the new garage, tie shoved in his back pocket, wiping invisible dust off the front glass, even though the place had been cleaned 3 times already. Sam bounced nearby, dressed in his best shirt, which still had a crooked collar and a grease stain near the elbow. "Do we really need scissors this big?" the kid asked, holding up the oversized ceremonial shears someone from the Chamber of Commerce had brought. Mason gave a half smile. "Guess they think if the scissors are big enough, the future cut's cleaner." But his stomach was knotted. He'd thought the hard part was building the place. Turns out, standing in front of it, knowing people were coming to see if you deserved it, was worse. Then, the SUV rolled in, the same white one. It parked too close, like it owned the lot, and when the door opened, Mason's shoulders tensed. Her heels hit the pavement first, her presence followed like a wave of cold air. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. She walked straight up to him, sunglasses still on, lips pursed in that permanent, practiced line. "So," she said, voice dripping with mock sweetness, "this is what charity looks like when it grows legs." Mason didn't rise to it, not anymore. Alina appeared behind him, stepping into the sun with a calm that silenced everything. "If you're here to support the opening," she said flatly, "you can stay." "And if I'm not?" the sister challenged. "Then you can leave." The crowd had started to gather, neighbors, press, friends. Everyone went quiet. Alina didn't blink. "This garage wasn't built with your permission. It was built with his vision," she said, nodding toward Mason, "and I'm proud to stand beside it." The sister scoffed, looked around, and realizing no one was siding with her, turned on her heels and got back in the SUV without another word. The silence she left behind was louder than any applause. Mason looked at Alina. She didn't smile. She just stood her ground. And in that moment he knew, he'd never have to stand alone again. The ribbon fell to the ground with a clean snap, and the crowd erupted into soft, polite applause. Mason stood frozen for a second, scissors still in hand, unsure whether to smile or step back. He'd never been the center of anything before, not in a good way. Sam was the first to clap louder, arms over his head like it mattered more than anything else happening that day. Mason finally let the corners of his mouth lift, just enough to show it mattered to him, too. Inside, the garage buzzed with life. People wandered through the bays, admiring the brand-new lifts, the polished floor, the gleaming wall of tools, hung with purpose instead of desperation. Old customers came up, shaking his hand like he was someone worth remembering. A few of the foster care volunteers from the county stopped by, asking about the youth training program he was starting next month. It was everything he said he wanted. But Mason couldn't focus, because all he could see, through the crowd, through the handshakes and the congratulations, was Alina. She stood off to the side, letting him have the moment. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, just jeans, boots, and a simple black shirt. but she looked like the kind of woman who knew who she was, and Mason couldn't stop watching her. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the sun began sinking behind the rooftops, Mason found her standing near the back wall, one hand resting lightly on the plaque. "Looks like people showed up," she said. "They did," he replied, walking toward her, "but only one showed up when it actually mattered." She met his eyes. "You didn't need me." He shook his head. "I didn't know I needed anyone. Until you." Alina didn't say anything. She just looked at him, like she was trying to decide if this was really happening, like she was still learning how to believe it, too. Then Mason reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face. And for the first time, he let himself feel it. The weight of everything that almost broke him, and the quiet power of the one person who never tried to fix him, just stood close enough to remind him he wasn't broken. Long after the guests had left and the echo of the day's noise had faded, the garage sat quiet under the soft glow of overhead lights. The air carried the scent of rubber and fresh paint, but beneath it all was something heavier, something unspoken. Mason leaned against the workbench, watching Alina as she walked through the now empty bays, her fingers trailing lightly along the edge of one of the new lifts, like she was trying to memorize it. He didn't speak at first. He didn't know how to, not with everything inside him still rearranging itself. Alina turned to him slowly. "It's beautiful," she said, almost in a whisper. He nodded once. "It's real." She stepped closer, boots echoing faintly across the polished floor, stopping just in front of him. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was full. Of things neither of them had said, of moments they'd lived through without putting words to them. "I didn't expect to care this much," she admitted. Mason studied her. "About the shop?" "About all of it," she said. "You, this, what we're building." He looked down at his hands, rough and stained and scarred, hands that knew work but didn't know how to hold something this fragile. Then he looked back up, straight into her eyes. "I don't want to mess this up," he said. "You won't," she answered, without hesitation, "unless you walk away from it." He didn't. Instead, he reached for her hand, slow and unsure, like a man still learning how to trust good things. Her fingers curled around his with a steadiness that surprised him. They didn't kiss, not yet. But they didn't need to. The closeness was enough. The truth of it sat in the quiet. Two people who had lived entire lives being misunderstood, standing in the middle of something they'd made from scratch. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, Mason closed his eyes just for a second. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't brace for something to go wrong. He just breathed her in and let it be. The shop was quiet the next morning, but Mason wasn't. Not inside. He moved with purpose, checking inventory, tightening bolts, lining up toolkits like precision could keep the storm in his chest at bay, but it didn't work. Not this time. Alina hadn't called, not since the night they stood inches apart, breathing the same air like it was enough. Maybe it should have been, maybe for her it was. But for Mason, silence always meant something was cracking. He'd spent most of his life preparing for people to leave, and when they didn't, he left for them. Easier to vanish on your own terms than to be the last one standing, watching the door swing shut. Easier to believe it was temporary before it ever got real. He caught himself staring too long at the plaque on the back wall again. Hands that build don't break. But hearts did. Belief did. Even trust if you leaned on it too hard. When the front bell chimed, he didn't look up right away. He expected Sam, maybe a supplier dropping in early. What he didn't expect was her. Alina stepped in like she'd never left, hair pulled back, eyes shadowed from something she hadn't slept off. She was holding something in her hands, something small and square, a photo. "I didn't mean to disappear," she said before he could speak. Mason turned slowly, rag still clenched in his hand. "Didn't notice," he lied. She didn't blink, just held out the photo. It was her as a child, younger than Sam, standing outside a massive house surrounded by cold stone and colder adults. She looked like she didn't belong. "I've spent most of my life trying to become someone people wouldn't walk away from," she said. "Then I met you, and suddenly I wasn't sure I was enough." Mason stared at her. "You think I'm the one who doesn't stay?" he asked, voice raw. She nodded once, almost ashamed. Then he crossed the space between them in 3 steps, took her face in both hands, and said the one thing he never said to anyone. "I'm not going anywhere, Alina." And for the first time, neither of them pulled away. The kiss didn't come like some sweeping cinematic moment. It wasn't soft or rehearsed or perfectly timed. It came out of truth, sharp, raw, and necessary. The kind that didn't ask for permission, because the silence had already given it. Mason's hands were still cupped around her face, calloused thumbs brushing the edges of her cheekbones, like he was trying to memorize the way strength and softness could exist in the same place. Alina didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Her hands gripped his shirt like she was anchoring herself, like maybe if she held tight enough, the years of pretending wouldn't creep back in. They didn't speak when they pulled apart. They just stayed close, forehead to forehead. The breath between them tangled like wire. Mason's pulse thundered, not from nerves, from disbelief, from the weight of what this meant. "I don't know how to be someone's good thing," he murmured. Alina smiled barely. "Then don't be. Just be the real thing." That hit harder than it should have, because he knew what pretending looked like. He'd seen it in the eyes of every customer who smiled tight and paid late. He'd lived it in the mirror every morning. He told himself this was enough, that he didn't need more than a wrench and 4 walls and a name no one remembered. But this woman standing in his shop, hair tousled from the wind, bunt, eyes too honest to ignore, this wasn't pretend. It was terrifying, and that's what made it feel like everything he'd spent his life trying not to want. Outside, Sam rolled up on his bike, skidding to a stop near the bay door. He paused when he saw them, wide-eyed and unsure. Mason looked at Alina. She gave him a soft nod, like they both knew the moment had passed, but not the meaning. That would stay. Mason walked to the kid and ruffled his hair. "You ready to get your hands dirty?" Sam grinned. "Always." Alina stayed back, watching them, arms folded but face soft. Mason didn't look at her again. He didn't have to. She was already part of the shop now, part of him. The weeks passed in a rhythm Mason had never known before. Steady, focused, real. The shop was no longer just a place where things got fixed. It was a place where people came to feel useful, seen. Sam brought 2 friends by after school, both quiet at first, unsure of what they were walking into. But within days, they were asking questions, learning the tools, building more than muscle memory. They were building worth. Alina didn't hover, but she was always near. Sometimes in the office, sometimes out back, working with her sleeves rolled up, clipboard in one hand, smudge of grease on the other. She didn't try to prove she belonged. She just stayed, and that said more than anything. Mason caught himself watching her sometimes when she wasn't looking, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she had become something he hadn't let himself want. Safe, present, not perfect, just there. He didn't know how to name what was happening between them, but it didn't need a label. It was in the way she brought him lunch without asking what he wanted, the way she laughed when the kids messed up a gasket installation and turned it into a lesson instead of a mistake, the way she never asked him to be more than who he already was. But even with all that, the doubt still came, quiet, creeping. He stood in the back office one night, staring at the financial projections on her laptop screen, numbers that stretched beyond anything he thought he could handle. Payroll, inventory, expansion. She believed in it, in him. But he wasn't sure he could carry it all. When she walked in, she knew. "You think you're going to drop it?" she said gently. The weight of all this. Mason leaned back against the desk, arms folded. I've spent my whole life holding things together with duct tape and muscle. This feels different." "It is different," she said, "because now it's not just you holding it." He looked at her, really looked, and for once didn't brace for the fall, because maybe she was right. Maybe it didn't have to hurt to have something worth keeping. The shop was closed for the evening, but the lights were still on. Mason stood in the center bay, hands on his hips, staring at the car in front of him like it held more answers than parts. It was nothing special, an old Civic with a busted alternator and a backseat full of forgotten fast food wrappers, but it was the kind of job he used to rely on just to keep the lights on. Now, the lights were never in question. He wiped his hands on a clean rag. The silence of the empty shop wrapping around him like a memory, the kind that didn't ache anymore, the kind that reminded him how far he'd come. Behind him, footsteps echoed across the floor. He turned to find Alina walking toward him, holding a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." He wiped his fingers again and carefully peeled the flap open. Inside was a certificate, heavy paper, elegant script. His name printed in bold. It was a recognition award from a local foundation, Community Uplift Through Trades. They were honoring him. His throat tightened. "How did they—" "I submitted your name," she said, "and they said the story sold itself." Mason let out a slow breath, the weight of it pressing into his chest in the way only gratitude could. He looked at her, then back at the certificate. But it wasn't the paper that broke him. It was what she pulled from her back pocket next, a smaller slip, handwritten, a note. He unfolded it. It was simple. "You were never broke. The world just didn't see your worth yet. But I did." He stared at the words, blinked once, twice. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his, like she'd always known how to. And Mason, for the first time in his life, stopped waiting for the floor to give out. He leaned in and kissed her, not to prove something, not to seal a promise, just because love had finally stopped feeling like a risk and started feeling like home.